All right. In this case, I will be arguing that subjectivity is a necessary component of truth, and that for truth to exist, there must be subjectivity behind it. And I will do so by defending the four following claims. The first claim is that truth is a characteristic that we attribute to belief or knowledge, both of which require a consciousness to be able to engage in, and thus truth is something that is, and because consciousnesses are necessarily subjective, truth therefore also is necessarily subjective. What I mean by this is that truth is, as we call it, is always going to be a relationship between a consciousness or a subjective observer and reality. And given that observer is a necessary component for truth to be able to exist, truth is something that is always going to be subjective. The second claim that I have is that humans have a finite capacity for knowledge, and an objective reality would encompass all of it and thus have an infinite capacity. And so any attitude or knowledge or belief that we hold necessarily is limited and thus is necessarily subjective. The comparison you can think here is that when you are looking at, say, a statue, you can only view it from one angle. Similarly, we can only have truthful knowledge or truthful beliefs about things that encapsulate a finite amount of stuff. And by ignoring the connective tissue to the rest of reality about that, we are necessarily getting a subjective view of what is true. My next two claims are going to kind of deal with the idea of scientific truth, which I think is probably the strongest counterpoint for this particular argument. My third claim is that the kind of things that we think of as scientific truths or like forms of knowledge claim that we have involve drawing distinctions around certain portions of the world in order for us to be able to better understand them by saying things like, this is a living thing, this is a non-living thing, this is a mineral, this is a plant. What I argue is that in reality, these distinctions don't exist. Everything is made up of the same matter. Everything is made up of the same atoms. And objective reality doesn't care about what things we put into what boxes, right? And so these distinctions are, of course, reasonable and necessary for us to be able to form coherent knowledge systems to be able to understand the world, but they do not constitute an objective reality in and of themselves. And the fourth and final claim that I make is that reality actually requires observers in order for certain portions of it to be true. So things like time and space and distance are relative as we understand them through Einstein, and thus you need to have a observer that has a characteristics like a certain position in space-time, a certain perception of time, and without that observer, those characteristics like time and like distance cannot be said to exist the same as they can for everyone. What that then means is that while an infinite observer would, taking into account all of time and all of the universe, a finite observer necessarily has a subjective perspective, and thus things like time and distance and space are necessarily subjective. I'll pass the open for your opening comments.
Okay, so I think there's a relative level of confusion about what it means for the truth to be, for truth to be subjective. Just to open, think about as a child when we see an infant or someone, you know, maybe it's our own child, no memories of it. When a child gains object permanence, it's basically the moment where peekaboo stops blowing their mind. You know, you look at a kid, you cover their eyes, and then you open them again, and they see the dad or the mother in front of them, and they freak out. It's mind blowing to them because they can't visualize a world where reality isn't created by their perceptions, where there is stuff that exists external to their own senses and their own reasoning. That's mind blowing to them, and it takes kids a long time to learn that. I mean, a long time, maybe a couple of years tops. But after they do, after they're no longer an infant, they can start to reason and figure this stuff out. The same thing applies to the rest of the universe. We understand that stuff exists outside of our perception. And the fact that we use our perception to access reality doesn't mean that the truth itself is only subjective. That's ridiculous. All that means is that that's the method by which we access it. All right, let's step down to my own case, and then we'll respond to my opponents. The first thing is the criterion should be most truths. In other words, you should gauge whether or not this resolution is true or false by analyzing, is most truth categorically subjective or objective? I'm going to give you two definitions, one of subjective and one of objective, so we have some clarity. Subjective truth in this context means something that is true due to experiences, feelings, or perspective. So, for example, if I said that my favorite food is sushi, that's a subjective truth. And no one else, you can't prove that that's wrong. If I change my favorite food to something else, then it's different. But I'm ultimately the determiner of that. We might say, I find this movie, or let's say X movie or X sculpture is beautiful. That's a subjective truth because it's based on my experiences. I can't be wrong about what I find beautiful. However, there are other things like, say, for example, there is a painting on the wall or there is a movie with such title that are true objectively. They exist outside of our perceptions. The people aboard the Titanic, when they hit the iceberg, or when you step over a staircase and not realizing there's a final step, finally realize it, that's a great example for how reality itself and truth itself is objective. It exists outside of our perceptions. So objective truth, of course, relates to a truth that is that is true regardless of perspective and feelings and experience. It's true independent of that. So just in terms of the weight, if we were going to say that, let's say every being with a mind can create their own subjective truths by, say, having favorite foods, etc. If we were going to say that every mind was capable of creating 1 trillion truths, which is just more than generous, no human being is capable of doing that. But even saying that, I want you to compare with the number of objective truths that exist. Let's just take the number of atoms in the universe, 1 followed by 80 zeros. It is objectively true that all of those exist outside of our perspectives and feelings. And that number, we're talking about trillions of orders of magnitude that outweighs the number of subjective truths. Reality as we know it is objective, and our subjective experience can't outweigh that.
Okay, so to deal with my opponent's claims on this particular idea, the first claim is that a subjective truth is something that is only derived from experience. So you use the example of like your disposition towards a sculpture as being beautiful, or the disposition towards a particular food as tasting in a certain way. The argument that I am making is that, and this also holds true for things that are objective about reality, is that in any case, your disposition or your attitude towards something like a food is not fundamentally dissimilar from your belief about some section of reality. In either case, you are having a relationship with something that exists, and that relationship and your attitude and your belief and your knowledge of that relationship is what constitutes the truth. And that this is my core argument. The truth in many ways is like a map of reality, right? Reality is something that exists and is out there. And the truth is what we use to judge what our kind of understanding or our belief structures about reality is. But what is important to remember here is that the map is not the territory, and the map can never be the territory. And the only thing that we have is better and better approximations of our understanding of reality. But it never actually gets to that point where it is 100% to what reality is actually like. And my opponent recognizes this when he identifies like the sheer number of atoms in the universe, the sheer number of things that exist, right? This goes a little bit onto my third claim, which is that, no, sorry, my second claim about the finite capacity for human knowledge. I'm getting my claims confused, which is that, once again, if you hold that something is true, right? Say like the number of atoms in a particular, section of like water or something similar to that, right? You are by definition necessarily having to consider only the things within the scope that you are perceived and ignoring everything that is outside that scope. Objective reality draws no such distinction between what is within the scope and what is outside that scope. And things from outside the scope ultimately influence things within that scope. So every time that you form a belief structure or a knowledge structure about the world, you are by necessity having to exclude other parts of the world for the sake of your understanding. In other words, you are only getting one perspective of that particular thing, which you are trying to form a truth claim or a knowledge claim about. And thus, that experience is necessarily subjective. Going back once again into my analogy of the sculpture, right? You can say that there are certain things about that sculpture, right? Its height, its dimensions, its weight. But you are only ever viewing those things one at a time. And there are things that you are not viewing, right? For example, you don't know what it looks like from the inside of the sculpture because we don't have the facilities to be able to make that kind of view. That we are limited in our capacity to view things completely objectively because we have certain senses that can only view it from the outside. Similarly, the human mind is like that, where there are certain boxes that we necessarily have to draw around things for the purposes of our understanding, which means we cannot know things truly objectively.
Okay, just a quick question. Did the iceberg that the Titanic hit, did that exist in the split second before the Titanic hit it?
It existed continuously. It is my claim that reality exists continuously, but the relationship that people had to it was something that was only formed at the point in time when it was become realized. And that is what truth is.
So it did exist beforehand, or it did not exist beforehand?
No, the iceberg existed beforehand.
Okay. So your only argument is that we just access it subjectively.
Yes. That because necessarily that like when we say something is true, right? You are making a specific claim about a knowledge claim, or you are attributing a characteristic to either a knowledge claim or a belief, right? You say, I know this thing to be true, or I believe this thing to be true. Therefore, truth is a facility of knowledge and understanding. That facility is part of cognition. Cognition requires subjectivity, and thus that is why why subjectivity is a necessary component of truth.
debate is a massive breakdown on a basic equivocation fallacy. So my opponent has said that because we must access truth subjectively, which is a giant duh. Like, of course, no human being can access truth without first being a subject human. He's saying that truth itself is subjective. So the big problem in this debate is, and the reason that our cases make no sense and clash and contrast, is that his argument has nothing to do with what truth is, just about how we begin to access truth. So let me clarify this. The first thing I want you to write down is access versus existence. Let's say that the way that you get into a party of friends is by bringing a bag of chips. That was the last name in your letter, lined up with bringing a snack, and that's what you brought. There is a difference between saying I can access this party by bringing a bag of chips and saying that the entire party will be filled with bags of chips. Just grammatically, ideologically, there's a difference between those two statements. And I know that's a strange analogy, but bear with me as we look through my opponent's argument for this resolution. He's not actually saying that truth is subjective, that it is true based on and according to perspectives and feelings, such as a statement like, my favorite food is sushi, which is true because I believe that my favorite food is sushi. That's the subjective truth that I as the subject can create. What he's instead saying is that objective truths are accessed through subject emotions, feelings and experiences. Go back to the Titanic. He says, yes, it is true that the iceberg existed regardless of the experience of the people aboard the ship, right? Who obviously didn't predict it coming, right? So he's willing to agree that objects exist outside of perception, that those are the objective truth. He's just saying we access those through subjective emotions, but that doesn't make the truth itself subjective. That just makes our access to it subjective. The second thing I want to get down to is Descartes' criticism on certainty. So the funny thing is, I'm a philosophy major. I kind of talk about this kind of stuff a lot. And what he's addressing is a very smart argument about why certainty isn't really accessible. In other words, Descartes' argument is, well, since we all use senses to access the outside world, and since we just kind of trust our senses without having a way to ontologically verify them, we can't really grasp onto certainty or know that something is absolutely true. I would totally agree. But this resolution isn't about certainty or absoluteness. It's about objectivity versus subjectivity. There's a huge difference between those two. So we might say we can't have certainty about things in life because we must trust our emotions to get us there. But we don't conclude that the truth is created by our feelings. I mean, for goodness sake, we don't believe that the iceberg didn't actually exist in the objective realm and was just created into existence by someone thinking it was real, right? That's not even remotely tenable. So my opponent's arguing that yes, we access the objective truth through subjective emotions, but that doesn't make the truth itself subjective. A good way to prove this, by the way, is the fact that we are in a debate and we are competing within different ideas. If I were to say, hey, I don't think the resolution is true, my opponent still wants to be able to win the round, right? Meaning that my subjective opinion on it doesn't change the truth of the resolution. There's a truth external to my perspective that is real. That's called objective truth. And if my opponent wants to have a chance at winning this round, he has to agree to it.
Okay, so I'm once again going to defend the definition of truth that I provided by making reference to my opponent's arguments. The claim that my opponent makes is that certain things are objectively true and that they are not changed by subjective experience, i.e., like the iceberg that is run to the Titanic, and other things are subjectively true, like say your taste disposition towards a particular thing, like sushi, right? It is true because you believe it to be true. But the point that I would the point that I would make here, right, is that your taste disposition towards something like sushi or ice cream, or your attitude towards a particular film about whether you found it good or bad or beautiful or whatever, right? That is not something that is fundamentally different from your relationship with other portions of reality, right? For example, if I don't like sushi, I can't just eat it and then try to form a new belief in my mind about, oh no, actually I like this. And then that's going to change how the truth about it, right? I put it in my mouth. It responds to my taste buds in a certain way. And then I form a belief based on that experience about what my attitude is towards around that. Similarly, all other ways that we have capacities to interact with the world around us are formed in a similar way. We have experiences, and those experiences can either be sensual or they can be something that is accessed through cognition, right? Like logic or thinking about things. But in either case, this is not that is not an objective reality that we are interacting with. What we are doing is that we are forming certain attachments to that reality via things like belief and via things like knowledge, and that those things necessarily is a component of subjectivity, and that because those things are necessarily linked to the subjective person's relationship between that, and that those are the only things in which we can make truth claims about, then necessarily truth is a component of those things, right? to give you to further elaborate on this, it is not my claim that people will the iceberg into existence from the iceberg that the Titanic hit into existence, but because that is reality, right? That is what exists, is that the iceberg exists. But the kinds of things that we can say about the iceberg is that its position, its position in the water, what it will do to the ship, so that we should hit it, and also like things about that, such as we should avoid it. All of those things are either belief claims or knowledge claims that you can say to be true or false, and those things are necessarily subjective, and that is what the basis of truth is on, right? Reality exists without the distinctions that we make about that, but the truth claims that we make about that are like an overlying map that we use to understand that. But that map is necessarily limited. That map is necessarily only understood through the capacity of our cognition and through the capacity of our senses, and therefore is not objective, and therefore I argue constitutes subjective truth.
So what my opponent has said is, he hasn't at all argued the fact that there's a massive difference between access and existence. This is literally what he said. He said, well, in spite of the fact that there's a massive number of objective truths, we can create a few subjective truths about them. For example, with the iceberg, he says, well, it's true, of course, that it exists outside of perception, but we can still form subjective truths about it, like that the iceberg is pretty to us, or maybe we should get out of the way. Like, we can inform our own subjectivity out of it. So here's the question of the debate, and I'm not really sure why my opponent wants to engage math at something that is just so ridiculously stacked in my favor. The only way for him to win this debate round is for him to prove that the subjective creations of individuals about objective matters can literally outweigh the number of objective truths about those matters. Let's walk back to the analogy of atoms, not the analogy, the actual example of atoms, so that we know what we're talking about. I get what my opponent's trying to say, and I also get as well, like, it is mathematically, it's difficult to count this stuff, right? Because it's so metaphysical in a certain sense, if not purely physical. And what my opponent's saying is, well, we can create a bunch of subjective truths about it. But here's my whole argument. Of course we can. Like, there will be subjective truths about the iceberg. If I'm aboard the Titanic, 1919, I can't remember when that was, and we say, wow, that iceberg's really pretty, that's a subjective truth. So if we want to evaluate the difference between these two, let's just look at the raw numbers. There are 1 followed by 80 zeros of atoms in the known universe. And it is true that those atoms exist. Each individual atom, were we to count them up, and it would take billions, trillions of years to get there. I mean, probably more. If we were to run that counting game, it would be objectively true that each individual atom exists outside of experience. The human mind, I mean, let's just take the number of human minds. 7.8 billion something. Let's just say 10 billion. Let's just be generous with my opponent. Then let's just be extra generous. Let's say that each human mind is capable of thinking 1 trillion. I mean, quite literally, you are able to think of more subjective truths than there are human beings times like 10. Like, let's just be as generous as possible to my opponent and say that that's the case. If we're going to take that and imagine that each individual human can think of over 1 trillion subjective truths on their own, the number that we're getting to is a septillion, which is 1 followed by 21 zeros shorter than the number of atoms that are in the known universe. And I just covered atoms. Like, I didn't cover anything else, like clusters of galaxies, like the fact that the building standing outside my window is really there. Like, there's not a mathematical game to be won by Pro here. And I get it's abstract, and I get it's difficult to measure. But if he is going to accept that there are such a thing as subjective truths, like I think that iceberg's pretty, and a set of objective truths like there is an iceberg, the number of objective truths will always be larger. Meaning that when you're asking the question, is truth categorically subjective or objective, it is on the vast whole something that is objective.
So I think that the definition to say that there exist more objective truths than subjective truths is something that I'm willing to concede to. So concede in the sense that under that definition, like saying, like, if we were to just take your definition of what is a subjective truth and take the definition of what is an objective truth and then tally them up, that yes, part of that there are far more objective truths than there exist subjective truths. Part of that constitutes my point, is that because the universe is so vast and infinite, it is impossible to be able to know it all. Thus, our understanding of it can never be something that is objective. And if unobjective truth is not something that conscious beings are able to access, then it is unfair to say that that is something that exists, right? The burden that I have placed upon myself is to say that subjectivity is a necessary component of truth. And to do this, I have pushed back on my opponent's definition by saying that there is a difference between a subjective truth, say the taste that you have towards an ice cream, and an objective truth, say like running into the iceberg of the Titanic. The thing that I pointed out there is that in both cases, you have an attitude towards something that is beyond your control. I have no control how my taste buds are going to react to sushi, just like I have no control over what's going to happen once we hit that iceberg. But I can form beliefs and knowledge and attitudes about that. And in all of those cases, that is true. I need to hear a response from my opponent about why those two things are fundamentally different. But I will also deal with the claim that he wants to make is that there is a difference between access and existence, because I think that that is a fair pushback. But I think it is also dealt by my fourth claim about the nature of scientific truths. So the thing that I noted a little bit in my introduction, right, is that to know the universe objectively is to deny that certain things exist. So stuff like color, right, is clearly only something that exists as long as there are observers with eyes that are able to perceive it. But to get a little more broad than that, right, we know from Einstein's theory of general relativity that things like the distance between objects, the time it takes for certain events to elapse, and even the sequence of those events can elapse differently depending on where you are as a point of a fixed observer. The nature of a fixed observer is that they are not omniscient and thus not are not objective, and thus certain faculties of the universe, such as time, such as distance, such as the space, such as the sequence of things happening, necessarily rely on fixed observers being fixed, not non-omniscient observers being able to be fixed and able to observe those things. What that means is that our subjective view of the universe is something that changes the nature of the universe as it exists, and that without us, certain things about that universe do not exist. And since those things are necessary for all other truths that we exist, every truth that we exist has a time component, has a distance component about it, that fundamentally existence changes based on where you are observing it from. And that facet of observation is also what constitutes the subjectivity.
Okay, so just to be clear, you admitted explicitly in the last speech that there are more objective truths than subjective truths. How on earth are the judges supposed to vote for you?
Admitted that under your scale of the definition, that if we were to just take your definition, which I disagree with, about what is a subjective truth and what is an objective truth, and tally those things up, you win. My argument is about the nature of truth, and I provide some counter arguments to your pushback. And the way that I expect the judges to take it out is to convince that my definition of what constitutes a truth is superior.
Okay, cool. So kind of the big problem with his definition is that he doesn't have one. Namely that I'm the only debater who's explicitly defined what subjective and objective means. Like, he's defined truth analytically and talked about what he believes to be true, which I've already linked over to Descartes' certainty problem, which he hasn't responded to either. Like, for him to, like, he's going to in the next speech, like, bring up some definition in the last 2 minutes. It's not going to matter. But just be aware, like, there's not a definition debate here. He's never engaged with the definitions I gave you, that subjective means based on feelings, tastes, opinions, etc., which, by the way, comes from Oxford, if you want to verify that and Google it. And the second thing is, if you just want a definition of objective that also comes from Oxford and is identical to what I gave you, is that it's a truth. Objective means it's something that is not influenced by those things like feelings, taste, and experiences. So, for example, I'll just come back to the same analogy because it seems to be working. If we say that my favorite food is sushi, my beliefs about that can change the reality. If I no longer believe that sushi is a good food, bam, I can change that. I can make my favorite food something else and make the original statement true. There exists a food called sushi is not influenced by my opinions. And if I don't say that there's such a thing named sushi, and I invent a whole government conspiracy about it and say it's actually a total lie. Sushi's just a bunch of robots that the Nazi government made up and then gave to America and we bought it. You know, like something silly like that. That can be wrong, right? My beliefs will not change the reality about whether or not sushi exists. So first, on his argument about how like I know he's like using nice philosophical rhetoric here, but like the analysis is just bad. Like it says, well, there's not really a difference in these categories. Like the universe is technically seamless, that there's not really a difference between liking a movie a certain way and these other categories of beliefs. They kind of like, yes, there is. Like your beliefs about whether or not you like a movie determine whether or not you like that movie. And your beliefs about whether or not the movie exists do not change the reality of whether or not that movie exists. So when it comes back to like this categorical argument, remember, yeah, like the difference is in the subjectivity, right? That your beliefs can actually alter the truth statement, the truth value, whereas other beliefs can't, right? So if we say, I like this movie, my beliefs about the movie can alter that. If I choose not to like the movie, I have personally altered the value of that truth statement. If I say the movie is real, the movie was produced in 2004, None of my beliefs can ever alter that. Like, this is not difficult. All right. So last thing he says as well, he says, what was his last argument here? He says, yeah, I think I just need to come back to the issue. Like, he keeps coming back to the fact that we access reality through our subjective senses. But like, what he's not understanding is that only proves non-certainty. It doesn't prove that the truth itself is subjective. For example, I might say, I can't be absolutely sure that there's a bird outside my window, but that doesn't mean that my beliefs will create the bird or not create the bird. The truth doesn't vary on our subjectivity. It just means that our subjectivity isn't always enough to access its actual objectivity. In other words, my personal limitations don't create what the truth is. They simply limit the objective truth. But there is or there is not a bird outside my window, and my beliefs won't change that.
Okay, so my definition of what truth is was included in my original claim, but I can make it more explicit here so you can respond to it in the last 9 minutes of your speech. What I said is that in order for something to be true, it has to be a characteristic that we assign to a particular statement, either it be a knowledge claim or it be a belief. Since that is the only thing that we can assign truth to, that is what truth is. And seeing as those things are subjective, that is what constitutes truth being subjective. To push back a little bit on your definition, right? You provided a couple of dictionary things about what objective truth is, right? That doesn't, like, dictionary definitions don't really stand up to like philosophical analysis. You need to provide some reasons why we accept those things to be true. But if you give an example of what is like your case of like an objective truth, right? Like you say it's like, my subjective experiences attitudes towards sushi change my truth about it. I pointed out that it doesn't. That is something that is a function of your taste buds, which you don't have control over and you can't just believe away. But secondly, that a food named sushi is an objective thing that exists. Food is an attitude towards something. Sushi is just raw fish until you decide that you want to eat it. If it is raw fish that is unfit for consumption, that it is not sushi, right? The name of a particular thing is a subjective thing that is not inherent to the universe, but rather a perspective that we came up with. So you're a very example of something that is objective, is something, it can be collectively subjective. Like, I agree, we all subjectively agree that this thing is food and that this thing is called sushi. But that is not an inherent quality of the universe as the way that you want to claim. In my last 30 seconds, I'm going to explain this. Truth, as it relates to knowledge claims and beliefs, provides us a map of that territory. And you can, of course, have better maps and worse maps, things that better represent reality and things that worse represent reality. But the important thing to remember is at the end of the day, the map is not the territory. The only thing that we can get is a good approximation of what exists. And that is what we mean when we are talking about truth. And because it is not perfect, truth is necessarily subjective.
Okay, so the giant overview is this. The opponent never, at one point in this debate round, offered a definition of subjectivity and objectivity. He then critiqued my definitions and saying that they weren't from a philosopher, which makes no sense. Philosophers use the definitions of words to then talk about why they matter or what they mean. The second thing is, his last statement condemns his whole analysis. He says, because the map is not a perfect approximation of the universe, bam, Khan agrees, we can't ever be, perfectly sure about it. We can't ever have a perfect approximation of it. I also agree. And the reason I agree is that statement has no impact on the resolution whatsoever. Like, I don't know why my opponent feels like it's a good idea to ignore defining subjective and objective, the fulcrum of what this resolution is asking us to discuss, then proceeds to make arguments about non-certainty and then wants to have your vote. Like, it boggles my mind. Okay, so let's send out. The first thing he says is, I did define truth. And he says, I define it as a characteristic that we assign, a belief. I'm not really sure why this definition matters. I'm not even sure that this is a good definition of truth, but I don't care because the only words that matter are subjective and objective. The resolution isn't truth exists. It's what kind of truth do we have? Is it a subjective one or an objective one? And it seems like, I don't know, bloody difficult to say the truth is subjective if you don't even know what subjective means. So let's come back to the dictionary definitions we've had. Subjective means that something is based on feelings, tastes, or opinions, experiences, etc. If we say that something is objective, we mean that it's not influenced by those things. For example, whether or not the iceberg exists is not influenced by my opinions. Whether or not I like the iceberg is certainly influenced by my opinions. If I think it's a pretty iceberg, well, bam, guess what? My opinions get to decide that. That's the definition of subjectivity. Like, there is no contest here. He doesn't leverage any other counter definition of what these words mean. So, like, logically, there isn't, like, this is a forfeit. Like, he doesn't actually tell you what subjective means and doesn't tell you why, like, that definition would be mine. Like, it's just so confusing. So, like, the last thing is, all of his analysis is saying non-certainty. Like Descartes says, like, yes, we use our experiences to access what my opponent uses as a brilliant analogy, the map, right? And the map of the universe is never a perfect approximation. But, like, that doesn't mean that reality then is subjective. I'll come back to my analogy before. My eyes right now and my ears, it's dark outside. I don't know if it's dark in Australia right now. but it's dark outside and I can't see if there are any birds on my trees. And my approximation of that won't be perfect, but there is an objective truth as to whether or not that bird exists, because as my opponent says before, stuff exists continuously. Meaning that outside, not based on my feelings, experiences, as I tip my hat to the Oxford Dictionary, there are some objective truths. And because my opponent has already agreed 2 speeches ago that the number of objective truths under my framework would be greater in number to his, then I should win. He hasn't contested the framework, so